So, have you ever thought about this? What do you do when your deepest moral belief that violence is always wrong comes face to face with, well, brute force? It's this incredible paradox, right? It pits the ideal of peace against the hard reality of aggression. And, it kind of forces us to question everything we think we know about right and wrong. Let's break this thing down.
Okay, so to really get into this, we have to start with the basics. We need to be on the same page about what we're talking about, and that's pacifism. At its heart, it's the absolute belief that violence is never, ever the answer. It's an incredibly powerful moral position, and honestly, it's the bedrock for this whole paradox we're digging into.
And this quote, wow, it just nails it, doesn't it? It's all about the sanctity of life. It's about someone making a conscious, deliberate choice to say, I refuse to be part of this cycle of violence. I mean, you have to admire that. It's a beautiful ideal. But, and this is a big but, it's also the exact starting point for the huge philosophical crash we're about to see unfold.
So first things first, let's really spend a minute with the ideal of pacifism itself. It is, without a doubt, a truly admirable ethical position.
Okay, so what's the core ethic here? It's that all violence is just plain wrong. Period. Even in self-defense. This naturally leads to a desire for what you might call moral purity, this ethic of having clean hands. But, it also rests on some really big assumptions, like the idea that not fighting back can actually calm someone down, or even shame them into stopping. It's a belief that the sheer moral power of your non-violent stance is enough to stop an injustice in its tracks.
Right, but here's the thing. An ideal like that can't just exist in a bubble. So what happens when it smacks right into reality? Well, that brings us to the aggressor, the one variable that changes the entire equation. And here it is. This is the question that flips the whole thing on its head. What happens when you're playing by a very strict moral rule book and the other guy is just, lit as on fire? This is that exact moment where the beautiful ideal collides with a very, very harsh reality. And this collision leads us to something called the mistaken assumption of reciprocity. That's a bit of a mouthful, but it's a huge idea. It's this critical and maybe even fatal belief that a violent attacker is somehow going to respect your moral code. According to the argument we're looking at, this is the exact point where that ideal of pure pacifism really starts to fall apart.
I mean, just look at this. You can see the massive clash right here on the screen. The pacifist is working from a place of shared morality, believing their example is persuasive. But the aggressor, they threw that rule book out a long time ago. They're operating on coercion, on pure power. It's literally like they're playing two completely different sports on the very same field.
So if these two worldviews can't possibly meet in the middle, what happens then? What's the consequence? Well, this leads to a pretty shocking idea. The pacifist, in this scenario, becoming an unwitting enabler, a failure of responsibility. Now, this is a really provocative claim, for sure. The argument suddenly shifts. It's not just about your personal moral purity anymore. It becomes about a much wider social duty. And the argument goes like this. By refusing to step in, the pacifist isn't just staying neutral. They're actually, unintentionally, helping the aggressor win.
And this quote right here is the absolute key. Not acting doesn't just make violence disappear from the situation. No way. All it does is make sure that 100% of the force being used is in the hands of the bad guy. It's basically handing over total control of the situation to the very person who's causing all the harm.
You can see how the logic just plays out one step after another, like dominoes falling. It all starts with a principled choice to not defend. But that choice directly leads to all the power, all the force being handed over to the aggressor. And the result? Well, the result is that the aggressor's victory is now pretty much guaranteed.
And there it is, the really tough conclusion to that chain of logic. The personal search for moral purity, for those clean hands, ends up becoming a practical failure of a deeper moral duty, the duty we have to protect the vulnerable among us.
So this line of reasoning, it forces a complete reframing of the whole choice. It's suddenly not about your own moral purity anymore. It becomes about a moral imperative, the absolute necessity of a just defense.
So you see, the aggressor, by their actions, completely changes the moral math. The choice is no longer a simple one between violence and peace. Why? Because the aggressor already took peace off the table. So the real choice, the new dilemma, is between letting unjust violence win or using a just defense to stop it.
And this brings us to the final, really powerful conclusion of this whole argument.
When you're facing active aggression, using limited, necessary, defensive force, that's not a moral failure. It actually becomes a moral imperative.
So let's just quickly trace that logic one last time. We started with this pure, admirable ideal of pacifism. But that ideal runs into a paradox when it meets an aggressor who's playing by totally different rules. Then, we saw how refusing to defend can accidentally help the aggressor, which completely reframes the choice. It's no longer peace versus violence, it's just defense versus unjust violence. And that leads to the conclusion that in these specific cases, a just defense is actually a moral duty.
But that powerful conclusion leaves us with a new and maybe even tougher question to chew on. If we accept this whole argument that defense is a moral duty, well, then where does it end? Where do you draw the line? How much force is just, and at what point does your defense risk becoming a form of aggression itself? It's a huge question and a really important one to keep thinking about.